Hello, this is Alexis Halkovic, your host for Catching North Stars. We're on our second episode of Season 2, Being Cyborgs, where we explore the ways people are learning from and getting creative with technology as it evolves at breakneck speed. This is Season 2, Episode 2, Hyperadaptive and Human, Envisioning the Future of Work Deliberately, with Melissa Reeve. Melissa's new book, Hyperadaptive, Rewiring the Enterprise to Become AI Native, was inspired by Melissa's experiences in lean manufacturing and systems thinking, leadership, DevOps, scaling agile, and learning organizations. She envisions strategic and collaborative ways organizations can reshape themselves to realize the possibilities of AI while retaining the learning and creative capacities of their people. Right. Hello, Melissa. What a joy.
Hello, it's so good to be here on this Thursday afternoon.
We were just chatting about the wonderful, great good fortune that we got to meet in real life last week.
Yeah, it was great.
And we made it.
It was at the Conference on World Affairs here in Boulder, Colorado.
Yeah, Melissa was moderating a session. I'm sure it was about AI.
It was about AI in the future. And what made it so cool is it was a science fiction writer who writes about AI. It was a policy wonk who probably, now I've offended her by calling her that, but she was super deep, interesting, rich background in policy. And then somebody who was representing more of the corporate point of view. And that combination really produced a very rich dialogue.
Yeah, it's great when you get an eclectic group of people to focus on the same topic because they're all looking at it from different standpoints. And how did you pull it all together?
Yeah, to moderate that, it was really talking about people are so concerned about the jobs. What's going to happen to the jobs? Some of the questions that came in were hyper specific. Somebody asked about what do you foresee in the economy and what should I be investing in? As if because you were up on the stage, you had a crystal ball. But yeah, I just tried to weave through the narrative. Like, what are you seeing? What can we do to be responsible with this new technology? And how can we stay grounded in our humanity and our own creativity?
That's a great jumping off point, since we are talking about the radical possibilities of leveraging other than human intelligences in our human lives. And you've written a book, which is coming out very soon, Hyperadaptive, where you're looking at how organizations can really, what they need to do to incorporate these new technologies meaningfully and how that's going to transform the way they work.
That's right. Yeah, I feel like there's been so much emphasis on the technical side. What can these technologies do? What are the capabilities? What are the capabilities this hour, tomorrow? They seem to be changing all the time. But really, I saw right away that it was going to change the way we work, and especially the people, the processes, and roles. And how can organizations really move at a more human pace to integrate these technologies? Because we know from previous technical revolutions that it doesn't happen overnight. And no, even if the companies wanted to wave a magic wand and have it happen overnight, that's not the way humans work. And so really, I felt like it's important and still feel like it's important to shine the light on the human side of AI.
I love that you talked about the pace, because the way AI was introduced to us, I felt like it was just like all at once. Here it is. And now you're going to have to adapt to it.
Yeah.
And it was like not a lot of preamble or structure around strategic ways of using it. It was more like experiment. It's like public experimentation is what it felt like.
And I have this analogy that I've been using, and I say AI is like a piano. in that it's easy to use, but it's not easy to learn. And I think that's the misnomer that so many people have, is just because it presents this chat window for most of us. That's how we're experiencing it. And it's very easy to use, just like you can walk up to a piano. It doesn't mean that there's nothing behind it. And you don't expect people to learn to play a song on the piano overnight. And yet somehow all of us in the workforce are expected to adapt to this new technology on a very fast pace without any sort of support, without a piano teacher, without even maybe go watch some YouTube videos on how to learn the sophisticated instrument.
Yeah, learn it yourself.
And yeah, and it's a big disconnect.
So tell me about your process of how you put together this vision for how organizations can do this thoughtfully, effectively, at a human pace. What was that process like for you?
So underneath the book, the hood of the book, Hyperadaptive, is the hyperadaptive model. And what the hyperadaptive model says is, if you are an organization, what I call a linear organization, so imagine strategy to execution, concept to delivery, lots of handoffs and delays all through those dimensions. I saw right away that AI was going to compress both of those dimensions. And so the question that it raised was, how do we iteratively and incrementally start to move ourselves from this linear space into this compressed space? And I have this background that's a little unconventional. So I like to say the path to the book started on a factory floor in Tokyo, where I was studying the Toyota production system. And from there, I got exposure to lean manufacturing and systems thinking. I saw the impact that somebody on the front line of the manufacturing floor, pulling the end on cord, the effect that could have on the entire system. And even though my career carried me towards executive leadership, primarily in marketing, I always had this systems view. And then I integrated Agile, I integrated scaling Agile, DevOps, and I spent about 6 years in an organization called Scaled Agile. And it exposed me to the world's foremost thinkers in some of these areas. And even thinkers like John Kotter, Clayton Christensen, whose work really is the underpinning of some of those other models, like Agile, like scaling Agile. And when I saw that AI was eventually going to stitch together multiple parts of a workflow, something clicked for me. And I was like, we've been here before. And the two reference points I had, one was factory automation, and then the other one was something called DevOps. And for the non-technical listeners, what DevOps is the automation of the software delivery pipeline. And what that means is that the way software used to be created is you would have somebody who'd create the code and they'd hand it off to somebody else who maybe would do testing. And I'm oversimplifying it here, but then somebody else would deploy it into production. And you had different people at different stages of that process. DevOps, in essence, automated those processes. And I thought, what can we learn from that effort that we can now apply to AI? And I reread this book called The DevOps Handbook. I know this is getting a little long in the tooth, but I promise you I'm landing it. The DevOps Handbook. And I integrated that with the systems thinking with Kotter, with Christensen, with Peter Senge, and learning organizations. And I woke up in the middle of the night on December 15th of 2024 at 2 a.m. The house was cold. I went rummaging in the dark for these 5x7 index cards, and I just started scribbling all these thoughts that were in my head. And when that turned into a 133-page outline, I thought, there's a book here.
That's a really amazing conglomeration of different perspectives that brought this about. And I'm really curious about that learning organization plus systems thinking plus technology. What was that inspiration, what did it feel like? What were the first kind of nuggets that crystallized for you as you were frantically writing on these note cards?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. And I feel like how I learned about many of the people that I mentioned was through osmosis. So at Scaled Agile, we had people who'd been practicing lean, agile, and organizational change for many years. And so what was happening is I was witnessing their experiences, how they were talking about organizations, how they were talking about how organizations change. I was seeing firsthand the challenges that they were running into. I'll just give you an example. They'd say something like, Melissa, this is great. We got our technology part of the organization working really well, but now the roles are changing and we're butting up against HR. And HR is not redesigning the roles as fast as we need them to be redesigned. And so that when you look underneath that, oh, that's because of this issue of silos. Or when we were practicing what I'm going to call layered retrospectives. So you have a retrospective as an individual. How did my last 2 weeks go? You have a retrospective as a team. How did our last team go? Or how did our last 2 weeks go? Then every quarter we'd have these retrospectives as a company. How did our last quarter go? And underneath that is the integrated learning loops of Peter Senge. And so in a way, I had the lived experience first, and then I backed into the theory in order to write the book. And I think that's a pretty different approach. And so in a way, the book was intuitively wired in me. And then as I was writing it, I would think about these concepts and then have to unpack it a little bit to really find and align it with the source.
That is very cool. That's to come from practice to theory rather than theory to practice.
Yeah, it's a little different.
But then it's entirely an entirely new thing developed specifically because we're in this moment when we have this new technology. We know it can do so many things, and people are using it in a lot of different ways, but usually individually, even within organizations. I was reading a headline the other day that like most CEOs says that AI has had no impact on headcount or even how people are doing their work, which is really interesting because I'm surrounded now by a lot of entrepreneurs and they're using it like crazy.
Yeah.
And it's a very different thing for an individual to say, I'm going to learn this thing and I'm going to do it for these tasks that I don't like doing. I want to make them more efficient and see if I can focus my time on things I'm better at, versus taking an entire organization and rethinking, as you just said, all of these systems, the roles of people. And then when you're changing the roles of people, are you not also changing their purpose?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is maybe. I'm thinking about somebody who is an artisan furniture maker. And it used to be that all of us, not all of us, anybody who was a furniture maker was probably an artisan furniture maker. And the spectrum of people who were making it, mass producing it, and the people who were artisans was very narrow. But as we moved into the industrial age, we saw that we could mass produce furniture. And the number of artisan furniture makers really decreased. Are there still artisan furniture makers? Sure. There's also IKEA. And I think the difference is that transition played out over a long period of time. So the shift in identity played out over a long period of time if you were a furniture maker. Now, based on what I've seen from factory automation and DevOps and things like that, what happens to the roles is people go from doing the task to building, monitoring, and maintaining the automations that do the task. Now, there's a question. Some people will have the aptitudes to make it from doing the task to building, monitoring, and maintaining. And to be honest, they're the best suited. If you have been looking at invoices for 20 years, you're really well suited for monitoring or babysitting an automation that's processing invoices. Now, the question is whether you have the aptitude or the attitude to do that. And I think that not everybody wants to make that shift in identity. And some people will naturally go there. Some people will be forced to go there, and some people will drop out. And that's what we also see too. I think part two, to answer your question, does it change your purpose? There are forward-looking organizations. Two that come to mind are MetLife and Unilever. And MetLife's program is called My Path, and Unilever's used to be called Future Fit. I think it's called You Work now. And what they do is they say, we understand that careers look today more like portfolios than ladders, and that you have a purpose as an individual and you have a set of skills. And it's our role as an employer to match those, your purpose and your skills with the initiatives. And we'll do that on a more ongoing dynamic basis rather than set you off on a track that is static for the next 30 years.
Okay, so they're, or would you say that they're role modeling how this can be done effectively?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to,
Yeah. And I talked,
say,
go ahead.
this is a total sidebar. It's not though, because you mentioned invoice processing, and I happen to have been an accounting services manager in my previous life, and we actually did a whole automation process on that. We were still getting physical invoices at the time, but I think that probably the vast majority of invoices now are probably sent electronically. I don't do that anymore, but it's just an interesting connection to the change in the process, even as you're automating the workflow so that there's not physical signatures on a piece of paper. It requires a lot of change management.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think you point out something else, whether you attended to or not, which is the old often lives alongside the new. And we need to support both processes at once. We have handwritten checks in the same environment we have cryptocurrency. And
cash,
this wholesale,
right?
and cash. And so this wholesale change of a system doesn't often happen. And so this is the whole artisan furniture thing too. We often still need people grounded in the legacy way of doing things, even as organizations and companies and people are moving on from the old.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It makes me think about a couple of different things. One is the physical environment and how we had for many people, a very abrupt move into remote work during the pandemic. And now there's this tension around returning to office or not returning to office, right?
Yeah.
And those things live alongside each other. And then, of course, there were many jobs where that wasn't an option, and that being in person. And now for me, I work a lot online, but I'm also very interested in working in person.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's often personality based too. I just got back from a conference called Unleash and Unleash America. And this was HR professionals who are trying to push HR forward in organizations. And why I bring it up is because there's also changes afoot in terms of the HR, just that employee experience and companies wanting to hire more contract employees and have potentially fewer full-time employees. And what I'm seeing, and again, this is a tangent too from our conversation, but I'm seeing more people of all ages getting put into the gig economy for white collar work, whether they want to or not. And so for some people, that's attractive. They want that contract work. They want the flexibility. Just some people really want to work from home. And then for other people, They'd rather work in an office. They'd rather have a full-time job. And so there's another example of the old and the new kind of living side by side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because it's also a way of making a separation between your personal life and your work life, is to have a physical separation. I work at home, and it is different when you go to a different place and you work there. You get dressed up, you have a
Mhm.
commute, which is this period of
Yeah.
transition. Then you come home. And I used to have all these rituals around that. And just getting ready. And then what do
Yeah.
you do on the subway? And changing clothes when I got home and going for a run or whatever. But this is getting off the topic of technology, but it is and it isn't, because the
Yeah.
technology is at the core of how we conduct our lives. And I
Mhm.
think that's what you're really getting at, is within the organization, how does the learning loops, this is what I wanted to go back to, you brought this up earlier. How do the learning loops change as you're integrating new technological ways of approaching work? Because it's
Mhm.
not as if we have a plug and play, this is an ERP that you're putting in. There are various ways of using these tools.
The word that keeps popping up is deliberate. And I feel like it's the missing word in this conversation around AI and AI integration. Like, you're nodding here for our audio listeners. And I get it, right? Like, it feels like we're in this uncharted territory. And so what's happening is people are letting things happen organically. And what I'm hoping to accomplish with the book is to help people see that there is a deliberate path that we can take in rewiring our organizations, whether that be learning loops or the roles or injecting learning. By learning, I just mean what AI can and can't do into our organizations. And with the learning loops, I think there's a lot of organizations that know, like, we should be integrating our learning and maybe be doing it at different levels. And maybe they've got a handful of processes for integrating the learning into the organization. What I see happening with AI, what I hope to see happening with AI, is that people really start to get intimate with their processes. And they're going to need to get intimate with their processes because those processes are going to change over and over again for years to come. And it's not going to be, if you redesign your process today, it's going to be out of date in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. And so really understand how you work, how you operate, and be aware of how it's changing, but also be aware of how you can integrate the learning back into that process. Because even in the organizations that I've been in, I was in marketing for many years. And at the end of that, let's just say that you did an A/B split test in order to test a headline or a button or whatever. What typically would happen is you'd get those results. The results were rarely conclusive, to be honest. It'd be like 43% of people like this headline and 48% of people like that one. It's a marginal difference. And so we wouldn't integrate that learning back into the next round. Just chalk it up. Hey, we checked the box. We did the test. We ran the
Mm-hmm.
experiment. How do we reintegrate it? And so with learning loops specifically, I think we have to be very deliberate in recognizing, one, what experiment we're running,
Yeah.
what the outcomes are. Does it prove or disprove our hypotheses? How are we capturing that learning? And then what do we integrate into our next experiment?
I love that example of that ambiguity of the result and how that doesn't actually provide learning. And I'm curious if you have an example of, you talked about these two different models, this organic model, which I assume just means like we're going to plug this in here and there, versus the intentional model. Like what does an intentional model look like?
Yeah. First, I'll share what's been happening in the market with the unintentional market. So it looks something like the board of directors reads the headlines and says, "Oh my God, AI is supposed to be happening everywhere in our organization." They put pressure on the C-suite, or if you're a nonprofit, whoever your leadership team is. Those people then go to their lieutenants and say, go do something with AI. And now you've got another group of people who feels ill-equipped to do something with AI, tasked with doing something with AI. And the rubber hits the road at that middle management level where they're like, okay, how do we translate this? And what's happening is what I call the bifurcation. You have a group of people, usually somewhere between 5 and 15%, who are naturally curious. Those are the people who are leaning in. Those are the people who are figuring out how to use AI in their everyday lives. And then you have everybody else. And they might be using it lightly, they might not be using it at all. So that's how the organic method is currently looking. What I advocate for is spinning up very specific support structures, what I call support structures. So you have an AI lead. What does that mean for your organization? How are you empowering them? That's your power user. AI learning is social learning. How do you start to unlock what that person has learned and share it with others? And it's a move from sage on the stage, one directional learning, where you have somebody broadcasting to a bunch of people, to creating what I call a learning arena, where everybody is exchanging information with each other. And a good example of this is what PricewaterhouseCoopers calls their prompting parties. And one, it sounds like fun. Let's go get pizza. Let's maybe have a beverage, and let's exchange what's working between us. And so that's a deliberate forum in which knowledge can spread. We fire up what I call an AI activation hub. And so this is one or more groups within the organization that's tasked with bi-directional learning. So ingesting the new capabilities of AI, handing it down to the AI leads who get it in the hands of practitioners, taking the frontline reality of practitioners, moving it back into the hands of the AI leads who then complete the cycle and say, here's the outcome. What are we going to do next? And these activation hubs are doing some pairing activities. They're measuring. That's a much more systematic approach than this more organic, let's see what happens approach.
Do you think that there are certain organizational culture types that are more likely to succeed with that model, or more likely to be even interested in implementing the model as you described it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what's underneath, you're going to see the growth mindset. You're going to see a culture of experimentation. So if you have a command and control environment with heavy egos, this tends to stall out in that type of an environment. And I think we've known for a while now that type of environment is the command and control, and the egotistical is outdated. My hope for all of humanity is that AI will be a forcing function to say that operating model has been outdated for a while. And now it's time to usher in a much more flexible, a much more responsive operating model that can keep up with the flow of new capabilities coming.
Wow. Okay, there's so much in there that I want to dig into a bit more, but that high level thought about command and control being out of style, I think there's a human desire for it in many cases. And I think that's really, we've seen this, like my background is in social psychology, and social psychology is the area where they first started looking at experiments in obedience and the authoritarian personality and all of those kinds of things, which really came out of World War II. And that this idea that people want that is because I don't know, there are people who are always curious. You mentioned the growth mindset. There are people who always want to learn. And then you talked about like how these organizations are going to stall out if you only have this certain percentage of people who are interested. But really, what happens when you do have an organization where not everybody has that growth mindset or that curiosity, and this might be a completely separate question, is what happens when the culture is not facilitating this is a learning organization, which I don't know. Is that normative? You gave some great examples of organizations that are really proactive in this area and that are applying this very seriously. And then I'll stop talking.
Yeah. So, well, the things that you're sparking a lot within me now. I have this question for you around like nature, a little bit nature versus nurture, and how much of the desire to be command and control is really a result of our early systems. And where my head goes is John Dewey and the create good workers, create good citizens. And a good worker responds to factory bells, and a good citizen can read, write, and do arithmetic. And the culture of many schools, especially public schools, that are still just entrenched in that mindset. And then how does that bleed into people as they move into corporations? And I bet you'd have a hot take on it. I don't know if it's within the scope of this conversation, but you're nodding your head.
It's really intriguing because we have so many like intellectual common grounds. And I went to Teachers College, and that's a John Dewey school. It's really about what does it take to have good citizens? And I think that's a different answer today than it might have been before. And I think that people often I don't know, I'm going to be a little bit pessimistic and circumspect about whether or not people want to put the work in to be good citizens. Because I just see so much to the other side of that, which is I'm going to sit back and observe and not participate and let the powers that be. And I don't necessarily think you need to be an activist or anything else to be actively engaged in your community. That can look a lot of different ways. But in terms of education, I think that's another can of worms. Those are huge questions. I don't have answers to those about whether or how to integrate AI into education. My daughter is 6. I'm like, no, like you can't do that at this age for sure. We're going to learn how to read and we're reading, writing, and arithmetic right now.
Yeah. It's so fascinating to ponder. So there was another angle of your question that I want to address, which is if you are leading this organization and maybe in this command and control way, and whether that's because that was socialized into you or not, how do we start to address that? And this is where some of those digital transformations or other organizational transformations have hit a wall. And it's something that I really tried to address in the book, which is all about incentives and budgeting. So in these large organizations, when you think about budgeting, your self-worth in a way as an executive is how much budget do I control and how many people are under me? And so in a hyperadaptive organization, I outline a new organizational structure. And I say that the organizational structure of the future moves away from the silos that were established after World War II and into an organization that looks like innovation circles at the top, which is your organization's internal VC project initiatives and research gets funded, and we get some interesting learning happening there. The middle layer is cross-functional value streams. We still might have functional specialists that can service those value streams, but mainly the people who are belonging in a value stream, it's function agnostic. And then the bottom layer is like a stability layer, who's keeping the lights on and who's running the data center. And I think the organization of the future looks much more like that. And when you think about it, an organization like that, and you think about how leaders are incentivized today, quarterly bonuses, did your function meet its goals, that needs to change in order to unlock this organization of the future. And so that's part one of the answer of how do we address leadership. I think part two, I'm going to draw on from my agile background. And this is all about having facilitation skills and again, being very deliberate about teaching these facilitation skills so that we can unlock more voices in the room. Because I think that is part of the complacency that you mentioned is people give up because they're not being heard, because they don't feel like they can invite the change that they want to see.
This is really intriguing. I'm thinking about psychological safety as being a
Yeah.
key factor there, because if you don't think you're going to make an impact or anybody's going to listen to you, you're much less likely to contribute. And if you don't contribute, then you're less likely to be engaged. It's just a vicious cycle.
Mm-hmm.
But this is such an intriguing change. And I love even the language that you've used, innovation circles. It assumes that there's a drive for creativity and knowledge, which is very appealing to me. And also, it's like, when you think about incentives, and I love the way that you just identified that these have to change. Sometimes is the incentive, what would the new incentives look like to be in alignment with a structure that is really, at the end of the day, empowering individuals to contribute more of their expertise?
Mm-hmm. Right now we have haves have nots, right? So usually it's top heavy in terms of incentives. You have a handful of executives that get quarterly bonuses, oftentimes aligned with stock performance or other internal goals. And then you have everybody else. And I know at one company I worked for, they gave a raise across the board. And the raise was, did we all achieve the outcomes that we were hoping for? The outcomes were very clear that the organization was moving toward. Did we as an organization meet those outcomes? And what that started to do is it started to create much more of a sense of teaming. And I also talk about performance reviews in the book and how right now there's recency bias and it's only once a year. And it's really another broken system. And again, it's based on this notion that we have a career ladder. And if we move from a career ladder to a career portfolio or a career network, then it also frees us up to get away from this. There's people advancing and there's people who aren't advancing. Like we're all just on a journey together trying to achieve certain outcomes. And whether you incentivize the outcomes at that global company level or at the value stream level, and for any listeners who might not be familiar with that concept, it's just the value you're delivering to the customer. I like to use the example of a bank because it's very common, which is maybe there's a value stream around new grads. What are the financial needs of new grads? What are the financial needs of retirees? What are the financial needs of the ultra high? So each one of those is a value stream, and they might have outcomes that are aligned to that. Did we achieve our outcomes? Let's all celebrate together.
That's a very different way of thinking about things. I think taking the hierarchy out also can eliminate a lot of drag.
Hmm.
And there's a model that I really like, this humanocracy, where you're looking at
Yeah.
the expertise of the people within the organization rather than ballooning a kind of bureaucratic layer where a lot of your revenue goes, but not necessarily a lot of your creativity. The
Mm-hmm.
creativity doesn't necessarily come from that. And I think this value, putting a premium on a shared goal, I mean, from a social psychological perspective, that should be incredibly motivating. And it should also bring people together in ways that silos and hierarchies would separate people.
Yeah. Yeah. You started the show by asking, Melissa, why did you write the book? And I want to put a pin in that because, yes, I wrote it for a lot of different reasons, but ultimately, I believe there's a better way of operating than we're operating today. And I think AI is going to be the forcing function to help change the systems. And I like to say that you can't expect 21st century results with a 20th century operating model.
I might steal that line. I'll just credit you.
Thank you.
That's a good one. Yeah, I think that's true. It feels a bit utopian, and you've incorporated the AI as a central piece of it. And so it actually feels very optimistic to me.
Yeah, I land the book by one highlighting, shining a light on the double-edged sword of AI. So there's the light and the dark. The same thing that could trash our climate could create innovative solutions. The same thing that could create income inequality could help us solve it. And I suggest that maybe AI can finally unlock what's called the triple bottom line, so that we're thinking about not only profit, but people and the planet. And it's really hard for organizations to do that right now. One, it's second and third order effects. Like, we don't always see that. But two, it's very difficult for humans to hold more than one system in their mind at a time. But maybe with the help of AI, we can keep track of our, not only how we're impacting our profit margins, but how we're impacting the people in our organizations and who are consuming our products, and the planet and the impact we're having on the planet.
Since you mentioned the impact on the environment, do you see a future in which artificial intelligence is not so greedy
For the planet?
for resources? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have to solve it. Like, it's table stakes. And I think there's people already thinking about it. I don't know if you've heard about them. People saying we're going to put the data centers out in outer space because it's cold out there, and then we'll use solar to power them. We absolutely need to figure that out. I did hear one other really interesting stat, and I haven't independently verified it, but it said, funny thing, we actually spend more water watering our golf courses in this country by like double than we do on cooling AI data centers, and yet nobody's talking about that.
I would love to see if you can verify that. I'm always very suspicious of golf courses because they are very resource intensive.
Yeah.
And in so many ways, they're just hogging up a huge amount of space, and then they use all this water and usually fertilizer.
Yeah.
And other things. So there are a lot of ways that we destroy the planet as humans.
It's true.
I want to see if we can go in a slightly different direction and just see, what do you think is something like joyful that comes out of these new types of human and other than human intelligences?
Something joyful that comes out of these human and other than human intelligence. I think, and this is me just speaking personally, I have found myself to be even more creative. And there is something called adjacent competencies that have been unlocked. If you've ever said, oh, I wanted to do a painting, but I don't have the skills, or for me, even, I wanted to write a book and AI was my development editor. I didn't even know what that was, but then I was able to find out and I was able to invoke that. And I feel like, just like we put a camera in everybody's pocket, and it unlocked people's creativity around photography and videography, that's my joyful hope for AI, is that it will unlock these new capabilities in everybody, and that we'll find a little piece of joy that we didn't have in our lives before.
Cool. Adjacent competencies. I'm trying to think if I have one. I'll have to think about that. As we get to the end of our time together, I would love to ask you to share a nugget of wisdom with our listeners.
That's a big question.
I always ask the same question.
Right.
I like to be predictable.
I think my nugget is one, I'm going to pull on one that we planted earlier, which is just be deliberate. And whether that means you're in an organization that is trying to integrate AI into its processes, or whether you are an individual and you are trying to integrate AI into your own world, there's a cost to it. there's potentially a cost to it, right? And we're just beginning to understand the unintended consequences. But I think if we remain in the driver's seat, meaning we are very deliberate with how we're using it, we're aware, then AI, the bots won't take over. We'll be there. And we still hold the cards, at least at this moment in time. So that's my nugget for the episode.
All right. I'm holding onto my cards, but I am also happy to share them with you. I think that's, for me, the other piece of it is something you mentioned earlier, and I just want to pin it, is that this sharing of learning that you talked about, these prompting parties, and that I learned this, I'm going to share it with you. I've seen a lot more of that, and I've actually then, I don't know, then I've seen of that kind of sharing in a long time.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah. So I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and everybody go check out Melissa's book, Hyperadaptive. It's going to be out. What, this is it next
May
week?
12th.
Oh, okay, May 12th.
May 12th. It's almost here. Yeah. So depending on when this episode drops, Hyperadaptive, Rewiring the Enterprise to Become AI Native. And it has been my pleasure to have this conversation. And thank you so much for having me on the show.
I'm Alexis Halkovic, and this has been episode 2 of Catching North Stars, Being Cyborgs. If you enjoyed this episode, please share on social media. You may also visit the website catchingnorthstars.com for additional resources about Melissa, previous and upcoming episodes. Visit alexishalkovic.com for information about my leadership coaching and organizational consulting services. Please tune in for our next episode where I will speak to Jose Marichal about his recent book, You Must Become an Algorithmic Problem, and his upcoming book, Machine Liberalism, Reconceptualizing Rights in the Age of AI. Special thanks to Julie Lancaster for recording the theme music, Sosma Karash Maichinko on accordion, signing off with great respect.